Tonight, the Australian Treasurer, Joe Hockey, released his second budget in what will be a 3-year term of this current coalition government. Potentially a problem middle child for Joe Hockey, something he and his fellow cabinet ministers seem to have been acutely aware of by conducting a staged campaign of releasing many of tonight's announcements over the last week or so and before that. What this means is that there haven't been many surprises tonight. Many of the announcements we knew before they were actually announced in the speech and in the budget papers that came out. So what are the key announcements that were made? Well, essentially they can be divided, I believe, into 3 areas. Firstly, those measures affecting small business and some good news for those in the smaller business area. Secondly, those affecting the larger multinationals and a crackdown around anti-avoidance, particularly of foreign multinationals. And thirdly, some announcements in the GST space. The fourth area is around superannuation. It's rare that we don't see a budget where superannuation is something that's looked at, but some good news tonight that there's minimal changes in the superannuation front and certainly no nasty surprises in that area. On the small business front, it's really the small businesses that are impacted by the announcements made in tonight's budget. The threshold for many of the concessions is a less than $2 million turnover. At Pitcher Partners, this is something we would have liked to have seen had a larger threshold. In any event, it's good news for those at the smaller end of the scale, and these announcements will be welcomed. So what are the announcements? Well, there's going to be a small business tax rate cut, 1.5% for corporates, and a 5% reduction in tax liabilities, albeit up to a cap only of $1,000 for those trading in an unincorporated enterprise. There's also small business changes which will provide an accelerated depreciation write-off of $20,000 this year. Mr Hockey's announcement tonight in the budget speech, he said that this would be immediate as of tonight, budget night, so $20,000 immediate deduction for capital expenditure. There's also a deduction that was announced for professional advisors' fees. This is something that was released in the last week or so, where $10,000 of fees, professional advisor fees, to assist with startups getting their businesses up and running will also be permitted. There's also some announcements that were made around CGT business restructures and allowing rollover on capital gains tax, where those structures would otherwise potentially be subject to capital gains tax under the current rules. In the large multinational business sector, there were several announcements that were made in tonight's budget, essentially a replay of some of the announcements that we heard Joe Hockey make over the last few days. There'll be a new multinational anti-avoidance law to be introduced in relation to foreign multinationals that have a presence here, but at this stage haven't done enough to create a permanent establishment or a taxable presence here in Australia. And interestingly, that rule is going to be written into the general anti-avoidance rule of Part 4A. So that focuses on the purpose of a transaction rather than looking at the actual arm's length nature of the transaction that might have been entered into. On that same theme, the OECD's transfer pricing documentation standards will be implemented, and there will be stronger penalties that apply also for multinational tax avoidance. So not only will a multinational fall foul potentially of the new anti-avoidance rule, they'll also have to suffer a 100% penalty on top of the amount that they are actually due to pay, plus interest. Essentially, in our view, this is a preventative measure. So really a crackdown on multinationals to show that the government is serious about profit shifting in Australia. There'll also be a voluntary corporate disclosure code that's going to be introduced. There's some further detail to be released around that, but really that's about managing transparency and disclosure of tax information so that the tax authorities and the greater public have a better idea of how corporates at the larger end of town are managing their affairs. And from a GST perspective, the key announcement that was made was obviously one that was made in recent days around the introduction of the so-called Netflix tax. Essentially a measure that will see offshore supplies of services and intangibles, digital intangibles, to Australian consumers now subject to the GST regime. There was another announcement made in tonight's budget around providing additional funding to the ATO to continue the rollout of their GST compliance programs. So there'll be no foot off the accelerator from the ATO's perspective in terms of the reviews that they're conducting on business. Another announcement of interest was just around the removal of the potential reverse charge rule that was going to be implemented for sales of going concerns and for farmland sales. The government had previously announced that it would backtrack on this announcement that was made way back in the Rudd government times, and tonight we've actually seen them confirm that in the budget. And from a superannuation perspective, as I mentioned before, no nasty surprises in tonight's budget. There is one measure that is of note, and that's something we were aware was coming, which is also around enabling superannuation funds to be available to those with terminal illness, and that's good news. So in summary, budget night tonight, I mentioned before that this is potentially the problem middle child for Joe Hockey and his cabinet, and every effort has been made to minimise the impact of that problem middle budget. It's with some irony then that those impacted by tonight's budget from a business perspective are those at the very largest end of town, those with greater than $1 billion turnover, and those at the very other end of the spectrum with less than $2 million turnover. So all that remains to be seen now is how the government goes in pushing through these budget measures over the coming months.